Hello, Ryan here, and welcome to Star Citizen Sunday. This is a weekly show which covers all of the news from the week just past. Be sure to subscribe if you like what you see, and let's get on with it. This week, Alpha 3.18 storms closer to a Wave 1 release. We finally get to check out the Polaris Interior 3D reconcept, plus members of the Modular Locations team discuss the potential of crashing Port Olisar into a planet. So, Inside Star Citizen this week began looking at one of the many tools CIG used to help with the development of Star Citizen. Now, this particular tool is called the Asset Validation Tool and is used to check assets before they are placed into a build to help reduce the potential of that asset breaking the build. Now, many times a day, CIG internally create new builds, and as work gets completed, it gets submitted to Perforce, which holds all the assets, code, and basically everything that goes into producing a game build, and this is done by hundreds of devs in all the various studios across the world. And so when a build fails, it is a big deal, as work can then cease until it's working again. So to protect the build, they run all the assets through this asset validation tool, and this is a kind of a pre-commit check, or a health check if you like, that ensures that it is all in good shape. And then if there are no errors, it gets committed. If there are errors, then it will actually tell the developer exactly what the problem is and what to do about it. Now, they do already have a similar tool in place, but over time it got very confusing to build out, with a lack of structure and ease of maintenance. So they created a much more robust tool, which has much broader adoptions for all of the team, so that they can basically write their own levels of asset validation to suit their needs, or to suit the asset that they're putting in. And so for the tools team, they don't need to create all these tests. They can allow the ones who are building their own assets to do it for themselves and make it very specific. This, for us as the player, means that as we wait for any build to come along, CIG are able to more thoroughly check the builds to ensure that nothing will fail ahead of time, which means less delays in getting a patch out, catching the issue much earlier on, so it doesn't delay the release. So hopefully going forwards with this new tool, if there are any delays to the release of the patch, it won't be because the build fails so much or an asset fails, as these will be addressed much earlier on in development. So a great insight into a very important tool, which is definitely a big win for the project, especially as the game and the complexity starts to scale up. Now next up, we finally got to see the updated Polaris Internals, and this is not just new concept images, but an internal 3D Max model layout rework. Now, the Polaris has been around since about 2017, and since then, many more features have been added to the game that were not known about or couldn't be planned for at the time of developing it. And so the interior does not fit the exterior anymore. Now they have worked out exactly how they want the interior layout to be and how that will affect the exterior, and the exterior itself is pretty much the same, aside from it getting slightly larger to accommodate the new interior, but the ship's role, its key visuals, are the same. It even appears to have gained a docking collar, which is very nice. Now, on the inside, it is very different. They basically started again. It now fits all of the new components, with many of them being capital class sized, like the shield, power plant and cooler, just to help support its role, especially now they know more about the resource network system. And for a quick sort of 3D tour, starting on the bridge, this has been opened up to provide more space and visibility. Behind this are the escape pods. From here is the captain's and XO's quarters. Further back you'll find the armory, then the crew bunk rooms and baths and showers, which I do particularly like, the bunks and how they're positioned on an angle. I think that's a very nice touch. Then there is the rec area for the crew to relax. Further back from here is the centre of the ship where the hangar is, which has actually had a size increase, so it can now fit ships like the Sabre, although many people are saying that it seems to have lost a bit of height, so we'll see how that affects everything. On either side of the hangar, you can see there is a med bay and a brig for holding prisoners, and then at the back is the engineering section that the dev says spans about 2 decks. So I do wonder if it's more like a 2.5 decks, as the original Polaris, I believe, had 3 decks. Now this section at the rear houses many of the standard components, and then the lower deck holds the larger capital class components. And so moving forwards from the rear on the bottom deck, you have the cargo hold, and then the torpedo room, which houses all of the torpedoes and the operation station for those operating them. So the Polaris is now concept complete, and they're pretty happy with the new layout, and now it is just a point of scheduling it for production. It is a large ship, so it won't be quick, but it will be worth it. So that was Inside Star Citizen this week. The Polaris is looking very sexy, and it should be a fun ship once done. But with that said, let's get on with Star Citizen Live. So this week's Star Citizen Live was with 4 members of the Montreal team who are working on the various points of interest and locations in the persistent universe. Just an informal chat about who they are and what they do for Star Citizen. Now, it is always interesting to meet the members of the various development teams, but during these chats they don't really reveal anything juicy about Star Citizen's development, although that was the case until around 2/3 of the way through, when there were some very interesting little tidbits. So the first question I want to highlight was, will there be any more derelict locations added to Stanton? And they say right now they are thinking about making more in Stanton first by utilising the Rastar tool just to help shape the tool out, and then use what they have learnt to then apply the same to the Pyro system and beyond. One member of the team actually mentioned that one of the reasons that the Montreal team were in the UK was to get some training on this Rastar tool. And I will also say that in 3.18 we are actually getting 30 more derelict outposts in Stanton, so they are already utilising this and pumping out the content quite massively. Next question is, what would you like to work on in the future? And one of them said building interiors using the procedural level building tools, which they are somewhat working on now, building out the interiors of many of the buildings at the landing zones, and they will be used for missions and gameplay. Now, another member of the team did actually mention that they are just about to start kicking off work on the underground facilities, but starting with the surface parts, making a big compound on the planet as we saw in the CitizenCon demo, and if Montreal's past record is anything to go by, they'll probably be done in about a week. Yeah, I'm only kidding. Now, the underground facilities will be worked on by many teams, not just the Montreal team. Other teams will be working on other levels, like under the surface. And actually, during this conversation, one of the developers pointed to the Microtech backdrop that they had sort of behind them on the screen, stating that a lot of the buildings on Microtech will have content in them. Some industrial, residential areas, commercial areas, rooftops, even sewers maybe, and holding cells like prisons. He says there will be so much gameplay. Now, these holding cells might be even talking about the bounty hunting admin offices that we read about in one of the monthly reports, where bounties will be taken to by the player, but getting all this content in a landing zone is very exciting to hear, and CIG have mentioned in the past that regarding planets, and specifically landing zones or other built-up areas, they want to provide enough content at these locations so that the player has enough to do for days or even weeks without feeling the need to even leave the planet and go elsewhere. And then the final dev said that they're excited for these mandates, all the things that they just spoke about here, and the Montreal studio itself is ramping up the team that they have there, so they will be taking on more and more mandates as they start building a bigger team. Next question is, will locations be modular, so they are able to be generated procedurally? And they say yes, this is exactly what they are doing for everything, building interiors, derelict locations, all of it utilising the procedural system as much as possible. Is the derelict Javelin village that we saw earlier on coming into the game? And they say no, this was just an onboarding project to help the Turbulent team get to grips with kind of Star Citizen's development process and its tools and assets. They will take the idea of bringing it back into the game one day and maybe address that at a later date, but as the tech that they used to create that has already moved on quite drastically, it would need to be built again from scratch. So I guess it's more a case of they have plenty to get on with now, most of which is better than what we saw with that Javelin wreck, but one day it might be brought in if they feel it necessary, and I personally would love to see it as a small little settlement around Daymar, place we can go and trade and so forth, but again, it wasn't intended, but never say never. Next question, how much does story or lore affect your work? Now, they say that they do bring in the narrative team early on in the development process, and narrative then go to work and bring their ideas to them. There is a lot of synergy between the narrative team and the development teams, and so devs can often bring their own ideas, narrative can work with that, or they can provide more lore-friendly ideas and just kind of build it all together. Next question is, will we see any derelict space stations? Now, I will talk about that in a second, but they did say that they have actually been talking about crashing Port Olisar into a planet, maybe. They did say that this isn't the team likely to be doing this, and if it does happen, which they're still undecided, it won't be for a long while, but clearly the seed of Port Olisar being destroyed or something happening to Port Olisar was planted years ago. Now, of course, this might not happen at all. They are just having a casual kind of talk about what they could do, but if I was to kind of interject, the Port Olisar station was built using very old station tools, and so it is not up to the current standard of the more modern modular station tools, which are more importantly far more performance friendly as well. So Port Olisar one day will have to be recreated using this new modular tool, and so I suppose the question is, which is what they're discussing, is what are we going to do with the old station? Now, personally, I would love for them to keep the original Port Olisar in-game in some way, maybe build it as a derelict version of itself, and in lore have a reason as to what happened to it, like it could have been attacked, it could have had some catastrophic event, a bit like Kovalex. So, years after the game has released, we could go back and visit it as a derelict whenever we are travelling through that system, because once more systems are here, how often are we going to go back through to Stanton? It'll be a long while before I do, because for many of us, Port Olisar was the very first and only location in the persistent universe, so for ceremony reasons, it would be nice to keep it in some fashion. But also, more addressing the original question, CIG do intend on having derelict space stations of varying types, and they were even on the roadmap once upon a time, where they have derelict cargo depots and derelict refineries, but I assume the process of developing them have changed, and I would not be surprised that all of the work that they are doing on the Pyro space stations will very much help when it comes time to creating them, as they are in Pyro in somewhat of a state of disrepair even though they are occupied. And personally, I am very excited for derelict stations. They would be a great location as a point of interest for exploration or missions, kind of feeling very Dead Space, Alien Isolation. So when they do start addressing them, I will be very much looking forward to hearing more. But before they finish this episode, they did say that working on Star Citizen is one of the best experiences in their career, and that it is the most rewarding project, which is definitely nice to hear from the developers. Now, next week's Inside Star Citizen is an episode themed on the journey to 4.0, checking out the audio concepts for the Pyro system, looking at how they create a new alien soundscape, with several more of these shows in the future. And then next week's Star Citizen Live is the rescheduled episode of the Master Modes from a while ago. Plus, he says there might be a special guest, but he can't commit to that just yet. So quite exciting. Again, a nice talk with some new faces here on Star Citizen Live, and some interesting tidbits of information. And as always, teasing us with Port Olisar's demise. So also this week, the Galactopedia had its monthly update, and this time round we learn more about the layer system with the Outsiders and the Sandworm, as well as the Min system and the Aricide's use. And in regards to Alpha 318, there were 4 patches almost back to back for the Evocati, each with many more bug fixes and crash fixes, plus some temporary changes to bed logging and a new character reset tool. I do suspect this week will be very similar in regards to build releases, but I'm also expecting a Wave 1 release. And if that happens this week, I will be sure to get on and get some videos out, plus I will be streaming it on the days that I stream. Of course, in the meantime, if there are any new Evocati patches that release, I will cover them here on my YouTube. But we are getting very close. So that brings us to the end of the show. If you do enjoy my content, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Also, I am able to do this thanks to my very generous patrons and channel members. If you appreciate what I do and would like to help make it even better from as little as $1 a month, all of the links are provided below.